Hi, this is Niyanta Spelman with Rainforest Partnership, bringing to you Our Planet, Our Future, a video podcast presented by Rainforest Partnership. Find us at www.rainforestpartnership.org and on social media. Join us as we bring interesting and compelling guests to talk about the environment, climate change, and rainforests. So we're here with Francis Seymour at the end of Forest Day at COP23. So tell us a little bit about first your book, and then what did you think about how the day went today and the plight of forests?
That's a lot.
That's a lot, I know.
Well, the book is called Why Forests, Why Now? The Science, Economics, and Politics of Tropical Forests and Climate Change. And it was an attempt to pull together between two covers, although we ended up being 400 pages plus, the best science, economic analysis, and political analysis about international cooperation to save the world's tropical forests and why that's important. So we really, tried making the case that even though emissions from forests are, less than 10% of the problem of global emissions and climate change, they're up to 30% of the solution, because forests are the only safe, natural carbon capture and storage technology that we have. And it's cost effective, and we have international agreement in the form of the Warsaw Agreement that was agreed under the UNFCCC and incorporated into the Paris Agreement. So we focus particularly on performance-based finance as the unique attribute of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which was the instrument of North-South cooperation that's enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And it's really the finance that's the missing piece. Today, we had panels on all the different aspects of this issue, ranging from the high policy agreements about the role of forests in a climate mitigation strategy, the science that backs up the need for that, and then the urgency, but also the specific things happening on the ground, ranging from corporations committing to get deforestation out of commodity supply chains, which are now the greatest driver of deforestation. Globally traded commodities such as beef, soybeans, palm oil, and pulp and paper are the key drivers of deforestation, so that's an important agenda, to the titling of indigenous land rights, because the science shows, and you can see it from the satellite, that where there's presence of indigenous peoples and their rights are respected, that's where the forests are preserved. So we have a big agenda ahead, and unfortunately the political attention and finance that are allocated to forests are far disproportionate to the share of the solution that forests represent.
So what are your hopes for what comes out of COP23?
Well, there are a couple things going on during COP23 that I think can contribute to elevating the profile of forests in a way that it needs to be. One is sort of in the technical negotiation side. The negotiators are working out the specific rules for implementing the Paris Agreement under Article 6 about, how international cooperation takes place. And that certainly has importance for REDD+ and the potential financial transfers or demand for forest carbon reductions, emission reductions in developing countries. So that's an important part. But also, this is where we sort of start the process of encouraging people to look forward to the 2018 stocktake and reviewing, where we are in terms of nationally determined contributions and the gap between those collectively and where we need to be to meet the 2 degree, much less 1.5 degree target. And the hope is that people will come to the realization that, we can't do this without forests. Right. And forests, what we see in terms of the allocation of strategies and finance to the NDCs and the commitments of rich countries, there's a big gap between what forests can do and what we're asking forests to do. And so we need to, close that gap. So I'm hopeful that this COP will help close, that gap and set us up for an enhanced announcements of ambition in 2018.
And so, there was that whole conversation about indigenous people not being represented in the same way in the climate talks and in the whole COP process. What are your thoughts about that?
It's something that we treat to a certain extent in our book, in that clearly the fate of indigenous peoples and the fate of forests are incredibly intertwined, because, it's just the fact that where there are indigenous peoples is a high degree of overlap for where there is remaining forests. And so you really can't talk about protecting forests without talking about indigenous peoples, and you can't talk about indigenous peoples without protecting forests. Now, at the beginning of REDD+, back 10 years ago at the time of the Bali Conference of the Parties, there was a lot of concern and protest and legitimate worry about the risk that putting a value on forest carbon would come at the expense of indigenous peoples. Because, historically, anytime somebody has found a value in the forests, often it's the political elites from capital cities or international that come in to appropriate that value and push aside the local people. So there was a legitimate concern that would happen in the case of REDD+. But I would argue that, at least anecdotally, what's happened is almost the reverse, that indigenous peoples have cleverly used the political space that's been opened both in the international negotiations and in particular national policy arenas to assert their rights agenda and, to assert their right to be at the table and assert that they are the, best stewards of the world's forests, and have actually made some incredible gains. And, the case I'm most familiar with is that of Indonesia. We had in our opening panel today Mina Setra from the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of Indonesia, and they successfully leveraged the national REDD process to get a constitutional court decision,
that's right,
opening the door to recognition of customary territories, and it's amazing. And now the President Joko Widodo has recognized the second group of customary territories in Indonesia. So I think there's a potential for a positive dynamic. We'd still need to keep our eye on the ball of the potential negative risks. And as Mina stated, indigenous people still continue to be killed around the world for advocacy of their rights. But I think there is a potential for a win-win solution here. And certainly asserting the rights of indigenous people's voices to be heard is an important part of that.
That's quite positive in that sense, isn't it? Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, anything else that you want to say about this is so personal to you?
It absolutely is.
And you talked about how you wrote the book and you were disappointed that not enough people outside were talking or reading the book or talking about forests. What would you leave the world with?
Well, what I take heart from is that even though we might not have been successful in getting our book and its messages into the hands of, say, the mainstream development finance professional or the mainstream climate policy professional who has not yet internalized the degree to which forests are important to achieving their own goals, what I do take heart from is that many of the people in forestry world have read the book and have been empowered by its messages and some of these memes. We put lots of infographics in the book to sort of make the messages simple. If tropical deforestation were a country, it would be the third largest source of emissions, right? Things like that, that can help them be effective as they fan out in the world. And as I talked about, the analogy with the fairy godmother. Yes. I think we're all with Cinderella. We're all fairy godmothers in helping empower Cinderella to, make her marriage with Prince Charming, which is, global climate action, on an equal footing commensurate with the degree to which forests are an important part of both the adaptation solution as well as the mitigation solution.
So I think we're going to leave with that wonderful story of Cinderella having sort of almost found her Prince Charming.
That's right. It's close.
It's close. All right.
All right.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Frances.
Thank you.